It's been nearly 3 decades since the unsolved murder of 6-year-old John Ramsey, a case that captivated the nation. And even though her parents always denied any involvement in her death,
they made up their mind on day one that I killed my daughter. You can't comprehend that anybody would be that evil.
Find the killer, take that burden off of my father.
But everyone knows that this $100,000 reward is for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the killer of our daughter. We feel like there are at least 2 people on the face of this earth that know who did this. And that is the killer and someone that person may have confided in. And we need that one phone call. We need the one phone call.
911 emergency. Oh my God!
It's been nearly 30 years since John Ramsey was found murdered in her own home. And yet, have we really learned anything at all? Or are we still clinging to the version of the truth that John Ramsey wanted us to believe? The one he crafted, manipulated, and used to steer the investigation wherever he saw fit. Patsy Ramsey played her part too. Every step, every word, it was all part of his plan. But now, that silence is about to shatter. Crime Cases is ready to expose the truth they never wanted you to hear. But if we go down that road, if we even entertain the idea that Burke Ramsey was somehow involved in what happened that night, then we have to confront something even more disturbing. We have to ask what a mother would do in the hours that followed. Patsy Ramsey wasn't just a former beauty queen or a grieving mother on TV. She was, above all else, a parent. And parents don't just love their children. They protect them. Sometimes to a fault. John had died not at the hands of an intruder, not because of some external threat, but from within the family, from her own brother. Then what happens next becomes a matter of instinct. The kind of instinct that doesn't come from logic. It comes from fear, from shock, from the animal drive to keep your family intact, no matter the cost. Let's say it was an accident. A burst of anger. A flash of jealousy. A single strike from a flashlight. Burke didn't mean to kill her. Maybe he didn't even understand what death meant. But Patsy knew exactly what it meant. She knew what a dead child meant. She knew what a dead child in her house meant. She knew what it would mean for Burke, for their family name, for the life they had so carefully built. The pageants, the money, the image, it would all be destroyed. So maybe she panicked. Maybe she looked at her son, still just a boy, and thought they'll take him away. Not just the police. The media. The world. They'll crucify him. They'll say he's a monster. A killer. And maybe in that split second, she made a decision. Not to grieve. Not to scream. But to act. And that's when the story changes. That's when grief becomes performance. That's when a mother picks up a pen and starts writing a ransom note. Not because someone took her daughter, but because someone took her life. And she couldn't afford to lose her son too. She wasn't covering for herself. She was covering for Burke. Because in her mind, maybe that wasn't lying. Maybe that was love. Twisted, panicked, desperate love. The kind that doesn't care about justice, only survival. There's something eerily quiet about that bowl of pineapple. It wasn't just some leftover snack. It was a detail. Small, but loud. A detail that refused to go away. A bowl of cut pineapple with a spoon inside, sitting on the kitchen table. Right next to a tall glass of tea. Both untouched by adult fingerprints. Both bearing Burke's. And it was that bowl, not a body, not a scream, not even the ransom note, that may have first exposed the cracks in Patsy Ramsey's version of the truth. Because when asked, she said she didn't serve any pineapple that night. She said she didn't even remember the bowl. Said she didn't know how it got there. Said John was asleep when they got home. But the autopsy says otherwise. There was undigested pineapple in John stomach. Which means she ate it. And she ate it not long before she died. Which means she was awake. At home. And that someone, not an intruder, gave it to her. So here's the question: why lie? Maybe Patsy didn't want to admit John got up that night. Maybe she didn't want to admit Burke was awake too. Maybe she didn't want to admit that there was a confrontation. Small, childish, meaningless in any other context. That spiraled into something irreversible. Maybe that's why the story had to change. Maybe that's where the lie began. Not with a murder, not even with a cover-up, but with a simple denial.
All I'm saying is that I did not feed her pineapple when we returned home from the White's house. She was sound asleep. She was put in her bed and tucked in goodnight.
And from that one denial, everything else had to follow. A new timeline, a fake ransom note, a fabricated intruder. All of it, possibly born from that one need to protect her son, to erase the moment before everything broke. Because once you admit to the pineapple, you admit to the timeline. Once you admit to the timeline, you admit to Burke. And once you admit to Burke, you've already lost everything. But the pineapple wasn't the only red flag. There were signs before that night. Signs that something wasn't right. That something had been off for a while. People just didn't want to talk about them. Or maybe Patsy didn't let them. Reports had surfaced, quiet at first, whispered through interviews, hidden in psychological evaluations, that Burke had displayed behaviors some might call alarming. Not violent. Not yet, but strange. Obsessive, private. And one in particular stood out: scatolia, the repeated smearing of feces. This wasn't just a one-time accident or childhood phase. According to those close to the case, Burke had been found smearing feces on his bedroom walls, on his belongings, even on John Benet's things. Her Christmas candy, her presents, her room. And that's not normal. Not at 9 years old. Patsy knew it, and not just as a mother. As a woman deeply invested in appearances. Beauty queen. Socialite. A mother who groomed her daughter into stardom. Pageants, crowns, stage lights. A mother who knew that the world watched, judged, whispered. So, imagine what it meant to her to discover her son, her only son, engaging in behavior so far removed from what the world expected from the Ramsey family. It wasn't just about Burke anymore. It was about the image, about the Christmas cards, the newspaper spreads, the home tours, the donations, the perfect family in the perfect house with the perfect children. What happens when that fantasy cracks? You cover it, you bury it, you wipe it clean. Because if someone, anyone, started digging into Burke's behavior before the murder, what would they find? A troubled boy, a disturbed child, or a future the Ramseys could no longer control. And maybe that's what scared Patsy the most. Not what had happened that night, but what would happen if someone connected the dots between the feces on the walls and the bruises on John Benet's back, between the pineapple and the broken flashlight, between Burke's outbursts and John Benet's final hours. Maybe she feared not only for her son's freedom, but for her family's name, for their legacy, for the lie they had been living. And if keeping that lie alive meant crafting another, a bigger one, maybe she thought it was worth it. Maybe she believed, deep down, that protecting Burke was protecting everything. And that lie, the one that might have started with a bowl of pineapple or a stained bedroom wall, didn't just protect a child. It protected a reputation. Because the Ramseys weren't just any family in Boulder. They were the family. The mansion on the 15th Street wasn't just big, it was pristine. Decorated down to every Christmas light. It was the kind of house you drive by and wonder what kind of people live there. And to Boulder, the answer had always been clear: successful, refined, admired. John was a millionaire tech executive. Patsy, former Miss West Virginia, was elegance turned motherhood. Their children were beautiful, their life inviolable. They were the American dream in Colorado stone and stained glass. And then one morning, it shattered. But even in the face of tragedy, image mattered. That was clear. Every public appearance was polished. Every interview is carefully constructed. Grief packaged, displayed, adjusted for lighting. But why? Why keep pretending even after the worst had already happened? Because the alternative was worse. If anyone in that family had hurt John Benet, whether by accident or design, it wouldn't just be a crime. It would be a scandal. A legacy destroyed. A headline that never goes away: millionaire family harbored killer child. Beauty queen mom raised a ticking time bomb. They wouldn't just lose a daughter, they'd lose everything. Business. Status. Respect. Belonging. And maybe for people like the Ramseys, that loss was just as terrifying as death itself. Patsy, especially, would have felt it first. A woman who had built her life on presentation, pageantry, perfection, poise, now being dissected on morning news panels. Her every word replayed. Her makeup was analyzed. Her motherhood was questioned. Was she neglectful? Was she enabling? Did she not see the signs? So maybe she decided not to give them any signs. Maybe she erased them all. Deny the pineapple. Deny the flashlight. Deny the behavioral issues. Deny that Burke was ever anything but a happy, normal boy. Deny that she had ever screamed. Deny that anything inside their home, behind those perfect windows, was ever real. Because, once the cracks show, the whole illusion collapses. And maybe, for Patsy, preserving that illusion wasn't just survival. Maybe it was the only identity she had left. But behind the makeup, behind the pageant smiles and matching Christmas sweaters, there was fear. A different kind. Not fear of grief. Not fear of shame. But fear of consequences. By the time the police arrived that morning, something was already wrong. Patsy wasn't just panicked, she was performing. The 911 call was frantic, yes. But listen closer, and you'll hear something else. Hesitation. A slip. Then Burke's voice, faint, but there. Even though they swore he was asleep. And it didn't take long for suspicion to settle. Not outside. Not from strangers. But from within the very walls of the Boulder Police Department. Because the crime scene was wrong. Too neat. Too strange. The body wasn't hidden in some alley, it was in the basement of their own home. The ransom note. 3 pages long. Written in the house. On their notepad. With their pen. Demanding $118,000. The exact number from John Ramsey's recent bonus. Coincidence? Maybe once. But not that many times in a row. The investigators looked inward. And it was clear they weren't looking for a monster out there. They believed it was already inside. And that's where the fear kicks in. If Patsy knew, or even suspected, that the truth pointed inward, not outward, she would have understood the stakes immediately. She wasn't just a mother anymore, she was a potential suspect. And in her mind, maybe she saw it all playing out. The arrest, the trial, the press outside the courtroom. Maybe she saw herself in handcuffs. Maybe she saw John too. Or worse, Burke. So what do you do when you're standing on the edge of that kind of fallout? You take control of the story. The ransom note wasn't just a distraction. It was a shield. A smokescreen built from familiar paper and a shaky hand. It said, "This wasn't us." It begged, "Please look somewhere else." It wasn't subtle. It didn't have to be. It just had to buy time. Confuse the timeline. Create doubt. Inject chaos. And if that letter bore resemblance to Patsy's handwriting, then the story had to get tighter. The denials are sharper. The memories are fuzzier. Because if she admitted anything, if she left a single thread hanging, it could all unravel. She wasn't just protecting her son now. She was protecting herself, her husband, the last remnants of a world that was already burning behind the scenes. Because Patsy Ramsey might have feared losing a child, but she feared prison more. And worse than prison. A world that finally saw through her. Patsy lied. Then we have to ask Di who taught her how. Because nothing about Patsy Ramsey suggested she could pull this off alone. Not the timing. Not the staging. Not the performance. Certainly not the 3-page ransom note, crafted with phrases pulled straight from Hollywood thrillers. If this was a cover-up, it had structure. Someone had to build it. And all signs point to John. John Ramsey wasn't an emotional man. He was calculated. Strategic. A tech executive used to high-stakes decisions, million-dollar contracts, corporate pressure. He knew how to stay calm when everything was falling apart. And that morning, when the police were walking through his home, when his daughter's body was still hidden in the basement, he was already operating like a man with a plan. This wasn't someone paralyzed by grief. This was someone navigating. He knew what a mistake looked like on paper. He knew what sloppy stories sounded like in court. And if he suspected, even for a moment, that Patsy, or Burke, or someone under that roof had played a role in John Bennett's death, then the only way forward was to control the narrative. Before the police, before the media, before anyone else even knew what to ask. And so, the training began. Not like a rehearsal, not with scripts and lines, but with not to say, what to forget, What to emphasize? Don't mention the pineapple. Say she was asleep when we got home. We have no idea where that note came from. Don't answer that without a lawyer. That wasn't panic. That was strategy. And the ransom note. It wasn't just written on paper from the Ramsey home. It referenced a dollar amount nearly identical to John's Christmas bonus, $118,000. A number only he and a few others would know. Not some random intruder. Not some deranged outsider. That figure came from inside. Some believe Patsy wrote it. The handwriting analysis couldn't rule her out. But if she did, then who gave her the number? Who told her to write that? Who stood over her shoulder, making sure the lines were just messy enough to look real, but vague enough to avoid contradiction? It wasn't just about emotion. It was about coordination. That coordination continued in the days and weeks after. John and Patsy refused separate interviews. They didn't sit down with detectives until months later, and only under legal protection. Not once did they speak freely. Not once did they allow the other to be questioned alone. That's not just grief. That's containment. John had the most to lose. Access Graphics, his reputation in business circles, his standing in Boulder's elite social class. It could all be ripped apart in a heartbeat. One wrong word from Patsy, one crack in the story, and everything he'd built would come crashing down. So maybe he stepped in, not to confess, but to direct. Like a CEO managing a crisis. Like a father protecting the last two people he had left. Or, like a man cleaning up a mess, not because he made it, but because he couldn't afford not to. And if that meant shaping a lie, then so be it. If that meant teaching his wife how to lie, then so be it. If that meant turning a murder into a mystery, then maybe that's the price he was willing to pay to keep what little control he still had. The ransom note wasn't just a distraction, it was a calculated device. A decoy dressed up in desperation. And under the lens of manipulation, John Ramsey may not have simply allowed it, he may have authored it. Think about it. John Benet was found dead in the basement of her own home. Her body never left the property. There was no real kidnapping. No failed escape. No demands made through phone calls. No follow-up. No intent to collect ransom at all. And yet, a 3-page ransom letter was the first thing handed to police. 3 full pages. Over 370 words. Written in careful, theatrical language. But not just any paper. Paper from inside the Ramsey house. Not just any pen. A pen from Patsy's desk. And not just any amount, the 118,000, the exact figure John had just received as a Christmas bonus. Coincidence? Not likely. The more you look, the clearer it becomes that note wasn't a cry for help. It was a set piece. A script. Planted there to shift suspicion, not away from a suspect, but away from a narrative. Away from the truth. Because in John's world, perception was power. He didn't build a multi-million-dollar company by trusting chaos. He thrived on systems, logic, outcomes. So when faced with a nightmare he couldn't control, his daughter dead, his family imploding, he reached for what he could control: the story. And that story needed structure. Step 1, create a crime that doesn't start inside the house. Step 2, build a villain no one can see. Step 3, buy time. A ransom letter checked all 3 boxes. It reframed the event, made it external. Suggested motive. Implied threat. It was, in essence, a business plan for misdirection. But who would write such a thing? Who would think to include film-style phrases like "we are a small foreign faction," or lines warning not to call the police, despite the note being left inside the house? Someone who knew enough to borrow from fiction. Someone who knew just enough about crime to mimic it, but not enough to make it airtight. That's what makes John Ramsey's fingerprints so metaphorically present. He understood systems. He understood people. He understood how to make something look just real enough to be believed, and just off enough to leave doubt in every direction. Whether he wrote the letter himself, or fed Patsy. The structure, the goal remains: deflect. Redefine the narrative before the cops could. Create chaos before the forensics could settle. And keep everyone looking outside, while the truth remains locked within. Because a dead child is a tragedy, but a murdered child in your own home, that's an indictment. Unless you write your way out of it. If the ransom note was the smokescreen, Then maybe John Ramsey wasn't just the architect. Maybe he was the fireman, rushing in after the damage was done, not to report the blaze, but to control the narrative of how it started. And depending on who lit the match, Patsy, Burke, or someone else under that roof, John had every reason to protect what was left of the house. Let's say it was Burke. A moment of jealousy. A flash of temper. He lashes out, JonBenet collapses, and in that instant, the world shifts. She's not breathing. Patsy screams. Panic. Chaos. Then John arrives. And he's not panicking. He's calculating. He's scanning the room, the timeline, the fallout. A dead child is devastating. But a dead child killed by your other child, that's annihilation. Not just for Burke, but for all of them. John would have known immediately, if this goes public, Burke won't just be seen as troubled, he'll be branded a monster, a sociopath. Their son will be dragged across newspapers, daytime television, schoolyard whispers for the rest of his life. They'll take him away. Maybe not in cuffs, but in custody. Psychological wards. Institutions. And that's if he survives the media storm. So what does a father do at that moment? He takes charge. He rewrites the ending. Because the moment JonBenet dies, it's no longer about truth. It's about containment. And John, with everything to lose, does what he knows best. He builds the illusion. And a ransom note. That's the cornerstone. Now shift the frame, what if it was Patsy? There's another version, one not often said aloud, where JonBenet wets the bed again, and in a storm of frustration, shame, exhaustion, Patsy snaps. A quick act, not premeditated, not violent in intent, but irreversible, maybe a push, maybe worse. And once again, John walks in after the fact. He sees what's done, and he does not let it spiral. Because now it's his wife, not just the mother of his children, but the symbol of their social standing. Miss West Virginia. The woman who runs charity galas and makes every Christmas tree look like a magazine shoot. If word gets out that she killed their daughter, even accidentally, it's over. The story isn't about grieving parents. It's an unstable mother. It's John's house of horrors. So maybe he convinces her. Not with threats, but with strategy. We'll fix this. We'll say it was someone else. We'll write a letter. Call the police. It'll look more real if you do it. That call, by the way, came almost immediately after the note was found. Despite the letter specifically warning not to contact police. Why break that rule? Because it looked better. More desperate. More innocent. More human. Exactly what a businessman would suggest if he were directing a crisis response. And that's the core of this theory, not that John wrote the letter to lie. But he wrote it, or orchestrated it, to protect. Not the truth, not justice. But what was his son, his wife, his name, his empire. And to do that, he didn't need to scream. He just needed to guide. Line by line. Move by move. Until the lie looked exactly like grief. The goal was control, then time was the currency. And the ransom note was how John Ramsey bought it. The letter didn't just create a fictional kidnapper. It built a pause. A delay. It told the Ramseys to sit tight, wait by the phone, and prepare the exact sum of 118 salvos in dollars. The note insisted they not contact the police, and that any deviation would result in JonBenet's death. But JonBenet was already dead. That part was never about saving her. It was about buying space. Time to think, regroup. John Ramsey was a man used to pressure. A man who made decisions not in panic, but in strategy. And in those early morning hours of December 26th, it's entirely possible he understood something the rest of the room hadn't yet processed. That time, not the truth, would decide how this story played out. By scripting a scenario where the kidnapper wasn't expected to make contact until the following morning, he gave his family what every suspect wants most: a head start, a window of hours before serious questioning would begin. A night to reset the narrative, remove inconsistencies, manage emotions, and, perhaps most importantly, make sure Patsy stayed in line. Not in a malicious way, but in a rehearsed one. Because Patsy, panicked, emotional, fragile, wasn't going to hold under pressure. John knew this. Her tears, her spiraling grief, her unpredictable reactions could blow the cover if not contained. So maybe he didn't yell. Maybe he didn't command. He guided me. Quietly. Deliberately. He told her what to say, what not to say, reminded her of what they were supposed to believe, gave her a version of reality she could cling to. One where Burke didn't do anything wrong. One where she didn't either. And all the while, the clock kept ticking. By the time the police were fully involved, the damage had already been done, or rather undone. The scene was compromised. The note was handled. The basement was deliberately left unchecked for hours. And when John finally discovered JonBené's body, it was he who carried her upstairs. Not an officer, not a medical professional, but him, cradling her corpse, contaminating the evidence, collapsing to the floor with an audience of friends already invited into the home. None of that was an accident. That was design, because the more chaotic the scene, the harder it becomes to establish truth. The more people in and out of rooms, the more fingerprints, the more confusion. And confusion is a defense tactic. Not in court, but in real time. John wasn't just stalling police. He was redirecting them. Boulder PD had doubts from the start. There were no footprints from the snow. No signs of forced entry. The basement window theory didn't hold. And the note, overwritten with drama, riddled with inconsistencies, rang false even to rookie officers. But still, their attention was divided. Because they had to chase the possibility of a kidnapping. Had to follow that trail. Even if it smelled like fiction. That fiction gave John cover. Long enough to shield Burke. Long enough to stabilize Patsy. Long enough to start turning grief into strategy. And maybe that's why, in the days that followed, their behavior wasn't that of devastated parents begging for justice, but defensive figures, flanked by lawyers, setting terms, delaying interviews, and controlling every frame of the public story. John wasn't reacting. He was managing. And Patsy, she was repeating. Crying, yes, but never deviating. Because by then, the story had already been written. And all that mattered was making sure no one rewrote it. To understand Patsy Ramsey's need for control, perfection, and preservation of image, you have to go back, way back. To Parkersburg, Patricia Ann Poff was born on December 29, 1956, into a world that believed in order. Her father, Donald Ray Poff, was a chemical engineer, precise, disciplined, a man of structure. He worked for Union Carbide, a major name in the American industrial boom, where precision wasn't just expected, it was required. Her mother, Nadra Ellen Ann, didn't hold a corporate title, but make no mistake, she ran her own empire. The home, the schedule, the expectations, and perhaps most influentially, the mirror. It was Nedra who shaped Patsy's earliest view of womanhood, not just as a daughter, but as a presentation. Appearance mattered. Manners mattered. Winning mattered. And in that house, little girls didn't just play dress up, they competed. Patsy was the oldest of three, the one expected to set the tone, to walk straighter, smile wider, lead by example. Her younger sisters, Pamela and Paulette, followed her into a world that revolved around stages, spotlights, and scripted answers. They weren't just raised to be girls. They were raised to be titles. Their upbringing wasn't abusive, but it was directional, structured, performance-oriented. A household where beauty wasn't just celebrated, it was expected. Where being presentable wasn't optional, and emotional display was often polished to meet public standards. So when Patsy entered the world of pageants, it wasn't rebellion, it was inheritance. A straight line from Nedra's expectations to her own sequin dresses and flawless hair. She wasn't just competing, she was becoming the product of her environment, the extension of her mother's design. And she won, Miss West Virginia 1977. Not just a crown, but validation. Not just for herself, but for the entire Poff family. Proof that beauty and discipline, if controlled properly, led to admiration, to status, to security. But what happens when someone like that, someone who's been trained from childhood to polish, smile, and win, is confronted with chaos? What happens when the spotlight isn't earned but forced upon her? By blood, not choice. What happens when her daughter dies? Not offstage, but in the very center of the home she decorated for Christmas. When the image of perfection she built, just like her mother did, is shattered beyond repair. She doesn't scream. She doesn't confess. she performs. Because that's what she was raised to do. Patsy didn't just grow up learning how to smile for a camera. She learned how to navigate a room. And that instinct, honed in childhood, followed her into adolescence, then into her academic years. She graduated from Parkersburg High School in 1975. By then, she wasn't just pretty, she was present. Known for her energy, her poise, her polished charm. She wasn't the girl who faded into the crowd. She ran committees. She stood at the front of school functions. She was, by all accounts, the embodiment of an all-American student leader. Not because she craved attention, but because she understood it, how to attract it, and how to manage it. But high school was only a stage. The real shaping came next. That fall, Patsy enrolled at West Virginia University, and she didn't go quietly. She chose journalism. A degree rooted in narrative, image, communication. She wasn't there for science or numbers. She was there to tell stories, to frame the facts, to learn the language of influence. And she didn't walk those halls alone. She joined Alpha Psi Delta, a sorority known for cultivating poise, networking, and social excellence. Within that circle, she built relationships, practiced charm, polished her presence. It was the perfect environment for someone already fluent in perception, a space where social status wasn't just observed, but engineered. By the time she graduated in 1978, Patsy wasn't just a young woman with a diploma. She was a brand, educated, articulate, connected. She understood how things looked, on paper, on camera, in a crowd. And that understanding would become everything later. Because when tragedy struck, and microphones reappeared, this time not for a crown, but for a corpse, Patsy didn't just grieve. She reverted to training, to control, to image, and whether that response was guilt, fear, or instinct, it was learned long before JonBenet ever entered the picture. By 1977, Patsy Poff was no longer just another ambitious college student. She had become a symbol. At only 20 years old, she was crowned Miss West Virginia, stepping onto a stage that didn't just celebrate beauty. It demanded discipline. This wasn't a small-town pageant. This was a statewide title, with cameras, judges, expectations. And Patsy didn't just compete, she won. It was the pinnacle of everything she'd been shaped to believe mattered: posture, presence, polish. Winning that crown wasn't just personal. It was familial. It validated the upbringing, the effort, the culture of presentation she'd absorbed since childhood. And the influence of that mindset didn't stop with her. 3 years later, in 1980, her younger sister Pamela followed directly in her footsteps, claiming the same crown, Miss West Virginia. 2 sisters, 2 crowns, in less than a decade. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a legacy. A system replicated within the walls of the Poff household, where charm wasn't just admired, it was expected. Where smiles were trained, posture corrected, ambition dressed in sequins. Patsy went on to represent her state at the Miss America competition that same year. She didn't place. But in the world of pageants, the ranking didn't matter as much as the platform. She had proven herself in front of judges, cameras, and strangers. She had carried her family name onto the national stage. And that meant something. It meant she could be more than just a contestant. She could become a persona. A wife. A mother. A figure in the community. And most importantly, someone who understood the weight of perception. Someone who knew what it meant to be watched. Because long before the cameras outside her Boulder home, there were other flashes. Other microphones. Patsy knew what it felt like to be studied. To be judged. And she knew how to manage that attention. How to stand still, smile through it, say the right words even when the world was spinning. And maybe that's why, when the attention turned cruel, when it wasn't about beauty but about blood, she didn't collapse. She performed, not because she was faking it, but because, in her world, composure was currency. And in the aftermath of a daughter's death, a shattered home, and a media storm closing in, Patsy Ramsey leaned on the only training she truly knew, and John's control. Made her so tough, the training of a queen who knew that image could be the difference between judgment and survival. In 1980, when Patsy Poff became Patsy Ramsey, it wasn't just the start of a new chapter, It was the beginning of a curated life. A life of vision, image, performance. John Ramsey wasn't just a successful man. He was a builder. Ambitious, strategic, sharp in business, and sharp in character. And for a woman raised on appearance, trained in charm, and schooled in public presence, Patsy didn't resist that structure, she embraced it. Their early years in Atlanta weren't quiet. This wasn't a couple settling into domestic bliss. It was a project. Together, they shaped what would become the Ramsey brand. Not just a family, but a statement. John built his company, Patsy built their world. She decorated, hosted, managed, smiled. Not because she had to, but because she knew how every gala, every Christmas party, every handshake. It was a performance, and Patsy had spent her whole life rehearsing. She gave up a career in journalism, a future she once imagined through words and headlines, to play a different role, a supporting one. But not silent. She didn't fade into the background. She turned being a wife into being visible. The woman behind the man, and the face of the home. Friends described her as radiant, magnetic, in control of every room she walked into. And she was, but always within the lines of the image they were crafting together. Then came Boulder. By 1991, they had moved west, for business, for lifestyle, for new opportunity. But Boulder wasn't Atlanta. It didn't bow to high heels and crown polish. It was a city of progressive minds, of quiet wealth, of liberal values. And Patsy, with her perfectly arranged table settings and lace-trimmed pageant dreams, had to learn how to exist in a place that didn't care how many titles she'd won. She didn't adapt. She persisted. She kept the events going. Brought her pageantry into her daughter's life. Dressed JonBenét like a queen in miniature. Ribbons, tiaras, rehearsals. But beneath all of it was a familiar thread. Patsy wasn't just sharing a hobby with her daughter. She was replicating something. Rebuilding a version of herself through JonBenét, but this time, with more glitter, more cameras, and higher stakes. And that vision of perfection, it demanded maintenance. Especially as cracks began to show. Burke, her son, didn't fit the mold. Withdrawn. Odd behaviors. Rumors of scatolia, smearing feces, on walls, on gifts, on his sister's things. Nothing ever formally diagnosed. Nothing ever confirmed. But whispers loud enough to make their way into housekeeper reports. And Patsy, ever the guardian of image, had no place for that in her version of family. So she compensated. With bigger events. With brighter decorations. With JonBenét, always polished, always poised, always performing. John was often gone. Business trips, growth meetings. Expansion of Access Graphics into a tech titan. Patsy was the one home, juggling cancer treatments, child rearing, reputation. In 1993, ovarian cancer nearly pulled her under. Chemotherapy, surgery, hair loss. And through it all, she kept smiling. She didn't stop planning events. She didn't stop organizing. And when she came out on the other side, alive, changed, shaken, she leaned harder than ever into the structure John provided. Because he had stayed, supported her, handled logistics, covered the world outside their home. And when you survive something like that, your body turning against you, you cling to whatever seems steady. For Patsy, that was John. His voice. His plans. So when the real crisis came, the one no one could ever train for, maybe she looked to him again. Not as a co-conspirator, but as a guide. And maybe he gave her one. Maybe he told her what to say. Maybe he told her what not to feel. Maybe he helped her build one last illusion, not for the world this time, but for survival. Because perfection was no longer the goal. Now it was just preservation. And Patsy Ramsey, the woman who once wore a crown, now stood inside a crumbling kingdom, trying to hold the walls with hands that were already shaking. If Patsy Ramsey was the face of the family, then John was the one behind the curtain, pulling the strings. He wasn't loud, he wasn't dramatic, but he was present, always watching, always calculating. While Patsy handled the surface, the parties, the ribbons, the performances, John handled everything else. The money, the strategy, the outcomes. And when it came to their dynamic, it was never a question of who loved more, it was a question of who led. John was a businessman, a systems thinker, a man who thrived on data, control, and execution. When something went wrong, His instinct wasn't to cry, it was to solve. So when John Benet was found dead in their home, that same instinct likely kicked in. But this time, he wasn't managing a business crisis. He was standing over the body of his 6-year-old daughter, and Patsy. She wasn't built for that kind of chaos. She was emotional, performative, and deeply sensitive. The cancer had already taken her through physical collapse. The pressure to maintain appearances had worn her thin. Her whole life was built around structure, but not the kind you build. The kind you follow. The kind provided by someone else. And in this case, that someone else was John. So if John decided, in those early morning hours, that the only way forward was to construct a lie, then Patsy, already in shock, already drowning in guilt or confusion, or both, might not have fought him. She might have clung to him. Because he wasn't just her husband. He was her anchor. The man who helped her through chemo. The man who built their fortune. The man who, until that moment, had always known what to do. So maybe he told her this was the only way. Maybe he said, if this gets out, we lose everything. You'll go to jail. They'll take Burke away. This is what needs to happen. I'll handle it. And she listened. Not because she was weak, but because she was conditioned. Conditioned to follow, to trust, to submit to the logic of the man she had always depended on. Add to that the storm already inside her, the shame, the fear, the flashbacks to the hospital bed. And it's not hard to imagine how she could be convinced to pick up a pen and write a letter that made no sense, but served a purpose. A letter that said kidnapping when her daughter was already dead. A letter that sounded like a movie script, because it was. A script she had been handed. Because for Patsy, it wasn't about constructing a story. It was about surviving one. And if John told her that this was the only way to protect Burke, to save their name, to keep what was left of their life, then maybe she never even considered saying no. Because saying no meant facing something even more terrifying. That John Benet was gone. That someone in the house had done it. And that her perfect life, the one she spent decades building, had collapsed into something she couldn't fix. And if John could give her even the illusion of control, she'd take it. Even if it was a lie. Even if it came with ink on her hands. But beneath the pageants, beneath the lights and ribbons and curated grief, there were quieter details. Ones rarely spoken about. The ones that don't make it into headlines or social media feeds. Because they're too fragile, too uncomfortable, too telling. One of them, a book, Why Johnny Can't Tell Right from Wrong, published in 1992 by William Kilpatrick, a book about moral collapse, the blurring of boundaries in children, and notably, a chapter that directly addresses one of the most taboo subjects in family psychology, abuse between siblings. According to certain investigative records, this wasn't just a book someone on the case stumbled across. It was allegedly handed to John or Patsy by the family physician. A doctor who had seen John Benet multiple times. A doctor who had treated her. Who knew her medical history. Who, according to some sources, had quietly begun to suspect that something inside the Ramsey household wasn't right. He didn't file a formal abuse report. He didn't call social services. But he did what some in his position might consider a subtle alarm. He handed over that book. Not with accusations, but with intent. And inside that book, a chapter that described, in raw detail, the signs of inappropriate sibling contact, boundary testing, power imbalances, misunderstood behaviors. The kind of material you don't give to just any parent. You give it when you can't say what you think, but you need them to look deeper. And maybe Patsy did. Because John Benet's medical records, while not widely publicized, are full of visits. Over 30 appointments with a pediatrician in just the 2 years leading up to her death. And not all for fevers or coughs. Some were for more delicate matters. Private area infection. Recurrent infections. Symptoms that, on paper, can point to many things. But when seen in patterns, especially with a child that age, they raise questions. The kind few want to answer. And yet no reports. No accusations. Nothing formal. Just whispers. Notes in medical logs. And a book, left behind like a clue no one knew how to interpret. For Patsy, this all existed under the surface. publicly, she was managing Christmas events, coordinating John Benet's pageant appearances, and preparing yet another perfectly decorated home for another perfectly photographed holiday. But privately, there was strain. Friends close to her, people who knew her before John Benet became a household name, recalled a different Patsy in the weeks leading up to December 25, 1996. Not the radiant hostess, not the poised pageant mom, but a woman stretched thin, exhausted, irritable, nervous. One friend said she was on edge, struggling to juggle the season's social obligations while still dealing with her lingering health concerns post-cancer. It wasn't just stress. It was something else. A current running beneath the surface. One no one wanted to acknowledge. Because acknowledging it meant puncturing the image Patsy worked so hard to keep intact. And that's the piece that rarely makes it to YouTube thumbnails or podcast sound bites. That behind the false walls of pageantry, behind the symmetrical bows and public displays of warmth, there may have been fear. Not strangers, not of the press, but of something inside the home, of something no one wanted to name out loud. And maybe, just maybe, Patsy knew. Not the full story, not the details, but enough to convince herself that silence was safer than truth. There was another woman in that house, not on the front page, not in the police interviews, but she was there, watching, guiding, sometimes in the background, sometimes in control of a presence as polished and purposeful as Patsy herself. Her name was Nedra Poff, Patsy's mother, and to understand the full scope of the world John Benet was raised in, you have to trace it back one generation further. Nedra wasn't just a supportive grandmother. She was a force. A woman who, long before Patsy ever wore a crown, believed in the power of image. She had raised her daughters, all three of them, in a home where grace, presentation, and achievement were expected. And Patsy was her masterpiece. A pageant winner. A symbol of poise. A walking reflection of everything Nedra had instilled. When Patsy later began guiding John Benet through the same world dresses, makeup, talent routines, cameras, it wasn't a new creation. It was a continuation, a family tradition, a legacy of public performance and private discipline. But Nedra wasn't just an influence from afar. She lived with the Ramseys for a time, was present in the Boulder home. She helped with the children, participated in holiday events, and, according to some accounts, had a direct hand in preparing John Benet for competitions. This wasn't just grandmotherly support. It was an active involvement, encouragement, direction. And if you believe that the Ramsey home wasn't as perfect as it looked, then you have to ask what Nedra saw and what she chose not to say. There are indications that she may have been aware of Burke's troubling behavior. Multiple reports suggest that housekeepers and staff had disturbing signs of emotional instability and inappropriate conduct, especially involving scatolia, feces smeared on walls, on gifts, on belongings, and sometimes, allegedly, on John Benet's things. But what's missing from the record is any clear reaction from Nedra. No formal acknowledgement that something might be wrong. Why? Perhaps because Nedra, like Patsy, understood that silence preserved image. That once you say something out loud, it becomes real, and real is dangerous when your life is built on presentation. And if she had already taught her daughter how to manage perception, how to smile through pain, how to dress grief in sequins, then maybe she was only continuing that lesson with her granddaughter. Protect the family name. Shield the image, keep the cracks beneath the surface. And so, when tragedy struck, and John Benet was found dead, Nedra didn't step into the spotlight. She didn't confront, or accuse, or even publicly mourn in the way some expected. She held the line. Like Patsy. Like John. Because maybe she knew too much. Or maybe she knew just enough. Enough to understand that saying one wrong word could unravel everything. Her role is rarely discussed. Not because it was insignificant, but because it was too close. Too much a part of the machinery that built the Ramsey illusion and helped hold it together until the very end. In a case where every thread is tangled, sometimes it's the smallest details, the ones buried in plain sight, that whisper the loudest. And one of those details, the outfit. When Patsy Ramsey called 911 at 5:52 a.m. on the morning of December 26, 1996, she was still wearing the same clothes she had worn the night before, a red turtleneck and black velvet pants. Not pajamas. Not a bathrobe. Not anything that suggested she had changed or gone to bed. She had worn that same outfit on the evening of December 25th, when the Ramseys attended the Whites' Christmas dinner, a formal, social affair. And yet, more than 7 hours later, after supposedly discovering her daughter missing, after calling police, after claiming to be woken from sleep in a panic, she was still dressed if she had never gone to sleep at all. To the untrained eye, it might seem trivial. A stressed mother, a traumatic morning, who's thinking about clothes. But to experienced investigators like former Boulder Detective Steve Thomas, this detail mattered. It didn't prove anything on its own, but it didn't make sense either, because in Patsy's version of events, the night had been normal. The family came home from the party. She put JonBenet to bed. She went to sleep. Hours later, she woke up and found the ransom note at the bottom of the staircase. But then why hadn't she changed? No one spends the night in velvet pants and full party attire. Not in a wealthy home with closets full of nightgowns and a woman like Patsy, who was known for her appearance, for her attention to detail, for a preference for being put together even behind closed doors. Unless, of course, she didn't sleep. Unless, in those missing hours between bedtime and dawn, she was awake, moving, thinking, writing. And, if that's the case, if Patsy remained in her holiday clothes not because she forgot, but because she couldn't afford the interruption of sleep, then the implication shifts. She wasn't just reacting. She was working. Steve Thomas believed that this supported the theory of staging, that the hours after JonBenet died weren't spent grieving, but planning. That the ransom note wasn't a spontaneous act of terror, but a carefully crafted misdirection. And that Patsy's unchanged clothing, the same red and black she wore while smiling at the White family hours before, was silent evidence that something had gone wrong long before dawn ever broke. It's a quiet clue. One not debated in YouTube thumbnails or social media threads, but it lives in the timeline. Fixed, undeniable, unexplained. And sometimes, the truth isn't in what someone says. It's in what they never bothered to change. 6 days. That's all it took for Patsy Ramsey to reappear in front of a camera, not in a courtroom, not at a memorial, but on live television, January 1st, 1997. CNN. A grieving mother, seated beside her husband, eyes hollow, voice trembling, wrapped in black as if her grief had been prepackaged. But there was something off about it. Not just the timing, though, that alone raised eyebrows, but the delivery. The choreography. Patsy barely spoke, and when she did, it was often fragmented, almost rehearsed to show she was a sorrowful mother. To a grieving parent, it could sound like a desperate plea, a warning from someone whose worst fear had come true. But to some forensic psychologists, it felt like something else, a projection. The kind of language that doesn't just communicate pain, it displaces it. A phrase that becomes a shield, a way to redirect guilt outward. A mantra meant for others, but whispered for herself. And then there's the body language. She leaned heavily on John physically, emotionally. When questions came, she looked to him. I waited for him to speak first. When she answered, her tone was almost uncertain, like someone trying to remember lines. Some close to the family have suggested that this wasn't grief alone. That John had prepared her. That before the cameras rolled, there were conversations, not just about what to say, but how to say it. Keep it short. Don't speculate. Show sadness, but not hysteria. Stay on message. Don't mention the note. Don't talk about Burke. Stay close to me. Because John, in his way, had always managed the optics. And now, the stakes were higher than ever. And yet there was another layer. One that rarely makes it into mainstream discussion. Some viewers noticed something in Patsy's demeanor that couldn't be explained by grief alone. The slurred speech, the glazed eyes, the pauses that seemed disconnected from the conversation. A few even asked outright, was she on something? The idea floated quietly, uneasily, that maybe Patsy was under the influence of prescription medication. Maybe she'd been sedated. Or medicated. Or, in a darker theory, that the events of the night of December 25th had involved some kind of intoxication. There were whispers that she'd taken something that night, something that dulled her reactions. That made her unstable. That possibly contributed to a tragic accident. It's a theory without concrete proof. But it lingers. Because when someone appears on national television just 6 days after their daughter's brutal death, and they don't cry, not really, and they don't scream, and they don't demand justice, but instead repeat a single line like a chant, it doesn't feel like closure. By the time Patsy Ramsey took her final breath on June 24, 2006, she had lived 10 years under a shadow that no courtroom ever fully addressed. A shadow not just of grief, but of implication. She died without a charge, without a trial, without a confession, but also without vindication. The decade following John Benet's death was not one of healing. It was one of survival. And for Patsy, survival didn't mean silence, it meant performance under siege. The public, the tabloids, the late-night monologues, they didn't just question what happened in the Ramsey house that Christmas night. They questioned her motives, her tone, her clothes, her handwriting. And it was that last piece, the ransom note, that clung to her like smoke. It was never proven she wrote it. Handwriting experts were careful with their language, not excluded. That's how the reports read. Not denial, but a space in between. And in that space, something strange emerged. An internal Boulder police report, never released to the public in full, quietly observed that Patsy had changed the way she wrote certain letters between her first and later handwriting samples. Specifically, the lowercase a and q. In early samples, the formations were consistent with the ransom note. But in subsequent ones, they began to deviate, just slightly. Like someone learning to walk with a limp they never had. It wasn't enough to indict, but it was enough to suspect control. Enough to make people wonder, did she alter her writing on purpose? Did someone instruct her to? There is no publicly available forensic comparison image that overlays Patsy's samples with the ransom note letter for letter. Some analysis exists in documentaries and legal texts, but the visuals remain either redacted or blurred behind proprietary or legal walls. And maybe that's why this detail, which could have opened new interpretations, never found its way into the viral conversation. Because speculation, that spreads. But forensic ambiguity, that dies in silence. What didn't die was the public's obsession. Even as Patsy and John moved back to Atlanta, tried to reclaim their lives, and filed lawsuits to protect their names, the noise never left. They sued, fought back. Some cases settled, others dismissed. But each suit was also a signal Patsy still believed reputation mattered, still believed the image could be repaired, still fought not just for memory, but for narrative. Her faith deepened. Her circle narrowed. She leaned into prayer, into church, into rituals that made sense when the rest of the world had collapsed. But friends say something had shifted, not just physically, after cancer in 2003, but psychologically. The brightness dimmed. The rehearsed smile flickered. There were days she wouldn't leave her room. Days she didn't speak at all. She'd survived cancer once, in 1993. Called it a miracle. But this time, it came back without mercy. And she died without ever telling her version of the full story. Privately, she had considered writing it. According to friends, there were notes, passages, journals, thoughts of a book without John's co-authorship. A final chance to separate her voice from his. But the body gave out before the words could. One friend, anonymously, described reading a line Patsy had scribbled in a journal. I failed her. I let it happen. They never knew if it meant guilt or grief, if it meant something she did or something she couldn't stop. And then she was gone. John stayed by her side to the end, even as the intimacy between them had long been questioned. And when she died, he buried her beside John Benet in the quiet cemetery of St. James Episcopal Church in Marietta. Side by side, mother and daughter, bound by something no grave could contain. Today, Patsy Ramsey is remembered in fragments. To some, she's a tragic figure, a mother caught in a storm too big to escape, misjudged by a world that never truly understood what grief does to a person. To others, she remains a question mark, a woman who maybe knew more than she ever said, whose calm under pressure wasn't innocence, but training. She never got her day in court. She never got her final say. She died in the same mystery that killed her daughter. And if there are answers buried in that silence, she took them with her.